Picture this. You're driving through the misty Himalayas when your GPS suddenly goes dark. The narrow mountain road splits ahead, and somehow you choose the path that leads to a village where everyone already knows your name. Not just your first name, but your childhood nickname that you haven't heard in 20 years. How would you react if an elderly woman you've never met casually mentioned the scar on your knee from when you fell off your bike at age 7? Or if a shopkeeper warned you about an accident that hasn't happened yet? This is exactly what happened to a group of friends whose wrong turn became their last turn. Trapped in a mountain village that doesn't exist on any map, where the only road out always leads back to the same cobblestone square no matter which direction you drive. They thought they were just lost tourists looking for gas and directions. But the villagers had been expecting them by name, waiting for them to arrive at this place between worlds where time doesn't move forward and the living aren't supposed to be. As their car rolled into that foggy village square that evening, none of them knew they had just crossed into a realm where their names were already written in stone, where the villagers spoke of their futures in past tense, and where a little boy repeated word for word a private conversation they'd had hours earlier inside their locked car. The most terrifying part wasn't that the village knew them. It was realizing why their names were there in the first place, carved into door frames and whispered in prayers by people who looked at them with the pitying eyes reserved for the already dead. Every attempt to leave led them back to the same fountain in the center of town. Their fuel gauge frozen at quarter tank, their phones forever searching for a signal that would never come. While the village lights glowed with an unnatural persistence that made shadows move in ways shadows shouldn't move. What would you do if you discovered you'd slipped through a crack in reality into a village that collects souls who were meant to die on the road? Before we reveal how these friends discovered the terrible truth about why everyone knew their names and whether any road could ever lead them home. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story will change how you see every wrong turn you've ever taken. The fog had thickened so much by the time they reached the village that Marcus could barely see 10 feet ahead. His knuckles white on the steering wheel as the headlights cut through the dense mountain mist like butter knives through smoke. Sarah checked her phone again. Still no signal, the screen showing that endless searching animation that had been spinning for the last hour since they'd taken that unmarked turn at the split. And beside her, Jake and Emma argued quietly about whether they should have stayed on the main road despite the landslide warning signs. The village materialized from the fog like something conjured from old photograph negatives. Stone buildings huddled against the mountainside with slate roofs that gleamed wet in their headlights. And as Marcus pulled into what appeared to be the main square, a circular cobblestone space with an ornate fountain at its center, the engine sputtered once before dying completely. "Perfect timing," Jake muttered. But his sarcasm died when dozens of lights suddenly flickered on in the windows surrounding them. Warm amber glows that seemed too bright for this remote mountain settlement that shouldn't even have electricity, according to their outdated guidebook. The villagers emerged from doorways like they'd been waiting behind them, not rushing but moving with deliberate purpose toward the car. Their traditional wool shawls and weathered faces giving them the appearance of extras from a period film, except for their eyes. Those eyes that locked onto each member of the group, with recognition that made Emma's hand instinctively reach for the door lock. An elderly woman approached Marcus's window first, tapping gently with arthritic fingers, and when he reluctantly rolled it down just a crack, she smiled and said in accented but clear English, "Marcus Chen, we've been expecting you since Tuesday. Your grandmother's prayers have been answered." The words hit him like ice water because his grandmother had been dead for 15 years, and he'd never told anyone on this trip his last name. But before he could respond, More villagers surrounded the car, each calling out names with impossible familiarity. Sarah Williams, your mother's worry brought you here. And Jake Morrison, the crossroads chose you. And Emma Patel, 3 times you've driven past death's door. The friends exchanged terrified glances as the crowd grew thicker, hands pressed against the windows in blessing gestures, while children peered between adult legs with ancient eyes. And when Marcus tried to start the engine again, it turned over perfectly, but the fuel gauge that had shown a quarter tank now read completely full. Impossible, since they hadn't stopped for gas in over 200 miles. "We need to leave right now," Sarah whispered. But the crowd had already begun to part, creating a pathway toward a modest guest house where a young boy stood in the doorway, holding 4 steaming cups of tea on a wooden tray. And as if reading from a script, he called out word for word the joke Jake had told 3 hours ago about getting lost in the mountains. A joke he'd whispered so quietly in the back seat that even Marcus had barely heard it over the engine noise. The elderly woman who had first spoken Marcus's name gestured toward the guest house with a patience that suggested she'd made this same invitation countless times before. And despite every instinct screaming against it, the 4 friends found themselves slowly exiting the car, their feet touching cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that shouldn't exist in a village this remote. The boy with the tea tray hadn't moved, his smile fixed and knowing as Emma approached him first, her hand trembling as she reached for a cup, only to freeze when he whispered, "The scar on your left shoulder from the swimming pool accident when you were 9. My grandmother says it still aches when it rains." The tea was perfectly sweetened to each of their preferences, though none of them dared to drink it. And as they stood in that impossible circle of recognition, a man emerged from the crowd, wearing clothes that seemed to shift between modern and ancient, depending on the angle of the light, introducing himself as the village keeper, before casually mentioning that Sarah's room had been prepared in the house with blue shutters, where her great-aunt had stayed in 1962. An Aunt Sarah had never heard of until that moment. Marcus tried to explain they were just passing through, needed directions back to the main road. But the keeper's sad smile suggested he'd heard these words before, perhaps hundreds of times. And he simply pointed to the fountain where names were carved into the stone rim in scripts that seemed to change when you weren't looking directly at them. Jake was the first to spot his own name among the carvings, the letters fresh as if carved yesterday, yet weathered as if they'd been there for decades. And beside it was a date, not of the past, but 3 days from now, that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. "The mountain chooses who it keeps," the keeper explained as more villagers gathered, their faces sympathetic but resigned. "And you 4 were chosen the moment you missed the warning signs, the moment you took the turn that doesn't exist in daylight, the moment your souls decided this journey before your minds knew where you were going." Emma grabbed Marcus's arm hard enough to bruise as a young girl approached with a leather-bound ledger, opening it to pages where their names were already written in fading ink alongside hundreds of others, each entry noting arrival dates but never departures. And when Sarah tried to photograph the pages, her phone camera showed only darkness, though her eyes could see the names clearly. The villagers began to disperse back to their homes as if a performance had ended, leaving the 4 friends standing alone in the square with only the keeper and the boy, who finally set down his tea tray and spoke in a voice too old for his young face. "The road you seek appears only when you accept why you're here. But those who accept never need to leave. And those who fight never stop arriving." The fountain's water ran backwards up its tiers, defying gravity in the dim light of windows that watched them like eyes. And as Marcus looked back toward their car, he noticed the license plate had changed to one from 1987. the year his father had died in these same mountains on a family trip that Marcus had been too young to remember. Until now, when suddenly he could recall his father's face reflected in every window of this village that existed between death and destination. The keeper led them through narrow alleyways where prayer flags hung motionless despite the mountain wind that should have been howling through the gaps, past doorways marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, until they reached a stone building that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Its entrance guarded by two carved figures whose faces changed expressions when viewed peripherally. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs, thousands of them, spanning decades. And Sarah gasped when she recognized her own face in a Polaroid dated 1973, standing in this very room though she hadn't been born until 1995. While Jake found himself in a sepia-toned image from the 1940s, wearing clothes he'd never owned, but somehow remembered wearing. The keeper explained that the village existed in a fold between moments, catching souls that were meant to transition, but hadn't accepted their fate. And as he spoke, Marcus noticed the other people in the photographs all had the same haunted look in their eyes. Not fear exactly, but a terrible understanding that seemed to grow stronger in each subsequent picture. Emma discovered her name written in multiple hands throughout a guest book that recorded arrivals but never departures. Each entry in her handwriting, though she'd never held the pen. And when she tried to write something new, the ink flowed backwards into the pen, erasing itself before forming words she hadn't chosen. I've always been here. The keeper showed them to their rooms, each one perfectly arranged with personal items they'd left behind years ago. Marcus's father's watch that had been buried with him, Sarah's childhood diary she'd burned after her mother's death, Jake's brother's dog tags from a war that had claimed him before Jake was born, Emma's grandmother's locket that had been lost in a house fire. Objects that couldn't exist but felt warm and familiar in their hands. That night, they gathered in Marcus's room to plan their escape. But their whispered conversations echoed from the walls in voices that weren't quite their own, speaking words they hadn't said yet, but would say tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, in an endless loop that the keeper later explained was how the village remembered. Not the past, but all the presents that never stopped happening. Jake tried to hotwire a motorcycle he found behind the guest house, but the engine turned over with the sound of his own voice screaming. And when he opened the gas tank, it was filled with water that reflected not his face, but his father's, who had died in these mountains 30 years before Jake was born, on the same date that was carved beside Jake's name on the fountain. Sarah attempted to climb down the cliff face at the edge of the village, but the rocks rearranged themselves beneath her hands, forming handholds that led her in circles until she found herself climbing back up to the same spot where Emma stood crying, having just discovered that the blue shuttered house contained a room full of letters she would write to her unborn children, children whose names were already carved into the doorframe, who would arrive in this village on a date that had already passed and was yet to come. The morning brought no sunrise, only a gradual lightening of the perpetual mist that clung to the village like a burial shroud. And when Marcus checked his phone, the date hadn't changed. It was still the same evening they'd arrived. Would always be the same evening they'd arrived, frozen at 7:43 p.m., even as they experienced what felt like days passing. The keeper returned with breakfast that tasted of memories. Sarah's plate held her mother's last meal, perfectly recreated down to the slightly burnt edges of the toast, while Emma found herself eating food from her own funeral reception, recognizing the specific batch of sandwiches her sister would make 3 years from now, or 3 years ago, or never. They demanded answers, threatened to leave on foot if necessary. But the keeper simply smiled and led them to the village temple, where hundreds of prayer wheels spun without anyone touching them, each rotation whispering names in languages that predated human speech. And in the center sat a massive wheel that turned once every time someone who was meant to die on the mountain roads didn't, creating another fold in reality where the almost dead could exist. Jake grabbed the wheel to stop it, but his hands passed through it like smoke. And in that moment of contact, he saw himself. Not as he was, but as he should have been. Crushed metal, broken glass, his body twisted in the wreckage of their car at the bottom of a ravine. They'd narrowly missed when they took that wrong turn. Except they hadn't missed it. Not in the version of reality where time moved forward properly. The keeper explained that the village was a collection point for souls in transition, caught between the moment of impact and the moment of death, stretched out infinitely in a space where neither had technically occurred yet. And the villagers were previous travelers who'd accepted their situation, choosing to remain as guardians and guides for the newly arrived. Emma refused to accept this, running to their car and flooring it down the mountain road. But the speedometer moved backwards, the odometer counting down miles they'd never traveled, until she found herself parked in the exact same spot, the engine cold as if it had never been started. While Sarah discovered that walking to the village edge led her through her own memories. First her apartment, then her childhood home, then places she'd never been but would have gone if she'd lived past this night. Marcus found the record room beneath the temple, where every name ever meant to die on these roads was carved into stone tablets that grew warm when touched. And when he found their names, they were still glowing with fresh heat, the stone around them cracking as if struggling to contain something that wasn't quite dead yet, but could never truly be alive again. The truth became undeniable when a new car arrived in the village. Another group of lost travelers. And Marcus watched the villagers greet them by name, while his own group stood invisible among them, unable to warn the newcomers because they were watching themselves arrive, seeing their own confused faces from 3 days ago, that was also right now, that would also be tomorrow. Understanding finally that the village didn't trap souls so much as give them a place to exist in the moment between heartbeats, between the seeing and the impact, between the wrong turn and its consequence. The revelation shattered something fundamental in their understanding of existence. When Jake discovered he could manipulate objects from before the accident. His wallet still contained the receipt from the gas station they'd stopped at hours before the wrong turn, still crisp and new. The timestamp forever reading 6:15 p.m. And when he called the number on it, he heard his own voice answering from that earlier moment, warning himself not to take the mountain road, creating a paradox that made the village bells ring in frequencies that hurt to hear. Sarah found her own proof in the village cemetery, where headstones bore the names of every traveler who'd accepted their fate. But the dates were all wrong. Some showed deaths decades in the future, others centuries in the past. And when she touched her own stone, already carved and waiting, she felt the cold of the earth that should have been packed above her body and tasted the metal of the guardrail they should have hit. The keeper revealed that the village existed in every timeline simultaneously, collecting versions of travelers from infinite possibilities where the same accident happened differently. Some had swerved left instead of right. Others had been driving faster or slower. But all had reached the same moment of impact that created a fracture in causality where the village could exist. Emma discovered she could walk through walls now, not like a ghost, but like someone whose physical laws belonged to a different reality. And in the church, she found a book containing every prayer ever said, for travelers who'd gone missing on mountain roads, including one her mother would say tomorrow, would have said yesterday, was saying right now in a world where her daughter never came home. Marcus tried to burn the book, but the flames froze mid-combustion, hanging in the air like amber sculptures. And he realized that even destruction was impossible in a place that existed between states, where entropy had no meaning and every action was simultaneously completed and never begun. The villagers began to change, their faces shifting to show them as they truly were. Previous travelers who'd been there so long they'd forgotten which timeline they originally came from. Some having died in crashes from the 1960s, others from accidents that wouldn't happen until 2087, all existing together in this pocket where chronology was just another direction you could walk. Jake attempted to drive through the village fountain, reasoning that if the roads wouldn't let them leave, maybe destroying the center would break the loop. But the car passed through the water and emerged dry on the other side, the fountain reforming behind them as if they'd never touched it. And in the reflection, he saw not their car, but the twisted wreckage it should have been, still tumbling down the ravine in slow motion. The truth became clear when new visitors stopped arriving, and the villagers grew transparent, explaining that the village only existed as long as someone refused to accept their transition. It was their denial, their desperate grip on life, that gave the place form and trapped others in the same limbo. And only by accepting what had already happened could they free themselves and prevent more souls from being pulled into this fold between moments. But accepting meant acknowledging they were already dead, had been dead since the moment they took that wrong turn, were dying still in an infinite present that stretched like taffy between heartbeats. Sarah was the first to understand what acceptance truly meant when she walked to her headstone and placed her palm flat against the cold granite, feeling the impact that should have killed her ripple through her bones like a memory trying to surface. And as she whispered, "I remember dying," her form began to shimmer with a peaceful luminescence that made the village bells fall silent for the first time. One by one, the others followed. Jake stopped trying to call the gas station and instead listened to the sound of metal tearing that had been echoing in his ears all along. Emma ceased walking through walls and felt the weight of earth that should have been above her. Marcus released his grip on the frozen flames and tasted the copper of blood he'd been denying, each acceptance causing another building in the village to fade, like fog burning off in morning sun. The villagers, those who had been trapped for decades or centuries, began to smile with genuine warmth as their own forms grew solid again, finally able to complete their journeys now that the newest arrivals had stopped anchoring them to this in-between place with their denial. As the village dissolved around them, the friends saw themselves clearly for the first time, not as living people who'd taken a wrong turn, but as souls who'd been given one last chance to let go properly, to say goodbye to their need to keep driving, keep searching, keep refusing the truth that every road eventually ends. The fountain in the square was the last thing to disappear, and in its final reflection, they glimpsed not the wreckage of their car, but a peaceful light, stretching like an endless highway into somewhere beyond maps, beyond fear, beyond the need to ever turn back.